Let me just tell you two or three things. The first one, if this is page 39, then turn to page 40. I'll take you through this. The first thing I'm going to tell you, which is kind of perhaps odd, is I think in general, the kind of the low, I would call the Willow Creek kind of contemporary worship service, I would call that emotionally cool contemporary. It's not charismatic worship. It's not hot contemporary. It's cool contemporary. It's the drama, the talk, which is the sermon is very, very practical. The music is contemporary, of course. I don't know. I have never been to Saddleback. I have certainly seen the videos of Willow Creek. I've never been to Willow Creek. But I would say that the criticisms you've heard, that is very boomerish, that is probably not going to be able to reach people very well in the future. I would like to confirm that criticism for the next minute or two. I would say that when I look at the kind of people that are coming up, when I look at you call them postmodern, yes. Are they more oriented to narrative? Are they more oriented to tradition? Are they more oriented to eclecticism? Are they more subjective and less objective? All that's true. And therefore, I think that, believe it or not, either charismatic worship, which is emotionally hotter, or liturgical worship, or maybe some interesting combinations, are much more likely to reach people in the future than what I would call cool contemporary, hot contemporary, or liturgical. Now, let me try to make my case. 4 things that people talk about all the time about postmodern people. The first one, which is now at the top of page 40, I'm going to try to keep it, is what I call transcendence. Is this page 40? Postmodern thinkers? Yeah, okay. See, right in the middle of that first paragraph, we read this. Young secular people are hungry for mystery, a sense of and a sense of transcendence. They're hungry for mystery and a sense of transcendence. They have a remarkable appetite for awe, wonder, and an awareness of the presence of the numinous, the ultimate. The trouble is that the contemporary seeker service that I'm talking about removes transcendence and mystery from its services by utilizing light, happy pop music, a breezy informal tone, and complete accessibility of voice. Hey, how are you? And sometimes using dramatic sketches that create a nightclub or TV show atmosphere. Now, I have found that my older secular people don't like liturgy or charismatic worship. They kind of like a very cool, detached. They get scared about. My older secular people in New York don't like awe and transcendence and wonder and emotional engagement. They're freaked out by it. But I would say non-white people and all people under the age of 30 really don't want anything like that at all. They're interested in transcendence. And the kind of the cool contemporary sort of seeker service took transcendence out. I don't think that's going to work very well. Secondly, roots. Again, I'll just read you part of the paragraph. Modernity was characterized by a great chronological snobbery. That's what C.S. Lewis called it. And worship the idea of progress in the new, right? That's the modern ideal. So we see modern architecture making a complete break with the past. Postmodern thinkers, of course, postmodern architects, very often have less confidence in the idea of progress and are much more interested in borrowing from the past. Contemporary seeker service, in many ways, is just like the steel and glass boxes of modern architecture. It has no tradition, it has no historic roots. I mean, you've got the Anglican tradition, the Lutheran tradition, you've got the Reformed tradition, you've got the Catholic tradition, you've got the Free Church Baptist tradition, you really now have a Pentecostal tradition. You have all these traditions, but the contemporary seeker service tried to have no connection to the past at all, of any sort. It's completely contemporary, and boy, younger postmodern people want roots. They love to see what G.K. Chesterton calls the democracy of the dead, which is what he calls tradition. G.K. Chesterton says, what is tradition? It's democracy of the dead. It's giving Christians in the past a voice. It's listening to them. It's letting them have some say. And postmodern people love the tradition. They love to see the creeds, for example, to say, one of the things I did early on was the first churches of New York City, which really were of New Amsterdam, were Dutch Reformed churches. So I very often would get out the Heidelberg Catechism, which of course is incredibly accessible and wonderful, and we would recite the Heidelberg Catechism. But what I would do is not say, we're going to recite the Heidelberg. I'd say, you realize that this is the original confessions of faith that were formulated by the original Christians of New York City in the 1600s. If you believe this, you are in solidarity with them. You're part of Christianity in New York and how it's, that's important. Roots. However, the contemporary service just cuts all the roots. There's a need for transcendence. There's a need for roots. Number 3, community. Again, there's, as you certainly have heard and read, I don't want to overdo all the stuff you've probably read about, is younger people need community. They're not as much people. They're not the Marlboro man. They're not the. They've often come from broken homes. They've been more mobile, and there's a hunger for friendship and community that maybe my generation didn't know. Now, if that's true, the contemporary seeker service emphasizes slick professionalism and non-participation, which turns the audience into a collection of spectators, by and large. Now, if you think about it, it's not just contemporary, sort of cool contemporary worship that I'm talking about, but even the sort of traditional Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist church service is very non-participatory. You're just an individual spectator. But if you get either into liturgical worship or into hot charismatic worship, you become a participant. You do things with people. Now, the liturgical, we're all doing them together. We all kneel together. We all go forward and take the Lord's Supper together. In the charismatic service, everybody sort of does it at different times. They may get up and they may say something, they may go forward, they may do things. The fact is, you're not an individual spectator. You feel like you're part of a community in both those kinds of churches. There's a horizontal dimension, not just a vertical dimension. And therefore, very often I find that either liturgical or charismatic, or some mixture of the two sometimes, are much more likely to engage them. And then last of all, this should be page 41. Narrative. I'm not going to take the time on this because I really don't want to take too much time. But generally speaking, the topical sermon that's completely practical every week, it's on how to raise your children, how to handle stress. The sermon is very, very practical, and as opposed to the liturgical tradition in which you go ahead and you're working through the story of Jesus from Advent to Easter, or you're working for the Trinity every year. So in the fall, you preach about the Father, who is God and who are you. You're more evangelistic, and in the middle, from Advent to Easter, you're preaching about the Son, and you're going through the story of what Jesus has done. And then after Easter, you're preaching about the Spirit, how to live a Christian life. And if you're doing that over and over again, you're preaching narratively. You're preaching the story. You're not just preaching topically. And I think that that's also, again, something that engages people. So I think the people who are criticizing the cool contemporary worship, ahistorical, very, very practical, they're probably right, that it's going to become more and more obsolete. I hope you can tell from what I'm saying is I don't know that I'm excited about so calibrating your worship so that only people who are 25 years old like it or can handle it, can handle the music or the sensibility, because that might make you just about as obsolete as a lot of this stuff looks like. I mean, 20 years ago, the kind of thing I'm critiquing now was really cutting edge. It's not anymore. That's the reason why both charismatic worship and liturgical worship has staying power. They've been here for 100 years, and they can be here for another 100 years. So that's my first. I don't know how radical that is. Maybe you say, oh, yeah. Well, you can come after me on that if you want. And that's the first. Secondly, the second issue is, and here you have to turn to page 42. Yeah. I'll just tell this to you instead of reading it because it's taking too long if I don't do it. I don't like, at this point, the historic versus contemporary worship war. Back and forth. Is contemporary worship okay versus is traditional historic worship? I think the fastest way for me to answer this is that, Well, I think I've already answered it in some ways. The ideal thing is for a worshiping congregation to recognize that you've got a tradition, or find one. There are quite a few. As a matter of fact, let me see if I can find you. If you turn to the bottom of page, if this is 42, 43, I think it's, wait a minute, 40, 41, yeah, 42, 43. Go to page 44 and look at the footnote. And look at footnote number 19. Okay? Got it? Footnote 19. Uh-oh, you have different footnotes. Oh, dear. It says James White. 31. Pardon me? Footnote 31. Okay, sorry. My numbers aren't your numbers. James White, A Brief History of Christian Worship, a very excellent book, by the way, identifies Protestant worship, just the Protestant worship traditions, as follows. In the 16th century, the Anabaptist, the Continental Reformed, which is different than the Puritan Reformed, Anglican, Lutheran. In the 17th century, the Quaker and the Puritan Reformed. Now, by the way, the British Reformed people were much more talking head, much less liturgical, much less concerned for the arts and for the sacraments. And the Continental Reformed is much more liturgical, much more based on patristic worship and so on. 18th century, you have the Methodist. 19th century, you have the Frontier, which today is kind of the Baptist, the typical Southern Baptist church. And the 20th century, you have the Pentecostal. And he says, right there, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 9. And he says every one of those has a certain shape to the liturgy and a certain liturgical tradition. My personal belief is that rather than just argue about whether we should be contemporary, whether it should be traditional, or think that a 50-50, what some people call blended worship, that's just a little too easy. Not only that, whenever people say, well, we like to have a mixture of hymns and contemporary songs, I say, well, what are your instruments? Are you really going to do Mighty Fortress Is Our God with a saxophone? No. On the other hand, do you really want to do Step by Step with an organ? No. So whenever people say we blend worship songs and hymns, I say, you're kidding. You must have, what do you do? Do you have a record? I don't know. Because you can't do them equally well, artistically, I don't see, in the same service. And besides that, they bring a different kind of joy, I think. So, anyway, what I'm saying is, let's be creative instead of just do the cookie cutter. Instead of saying we're going to do contemporary, you probably need to have contemporary elements. You certainly need to root yourself in some tradition and work out of your tradition. And I think, and you can read about this in here, I would say that instead of saying, do you contemporary, do you do traditional, or do you do blended worship, I would like to say none of the above. I don't think you should. We don't. And this might be a surprise to some people, but our morning service is fairly, we decided because of the instrumentation at Redeemer, we couldn't possibly do contemporary, there's some great contemporary Christian music, and we couldn't do traditional hymns at the same service because of the instruments. So in the morning we have brass, string quartets, harps, we have an organ, and we do classical historic music. So we'll do Bach, and we'll do Beethoven, we'll do the traditional hymns, the big hymns. And also, by the way, the acoustics where we have our morning service are terrible. And because they're terrible, you got to have these big hymns. Because when you sing, the sound just sort of, you can't even hear yourself. It just goes away. There's no reverb, there's no resonance, it's terrible. And so that's one of the reasons why we chose the music we did. In the evening service, we have a jazz band. And we use contemporary music, but we use jazz arrangements to them. And we did that partly because I don't think that would work most other places, because in the city, jazz is a fairly sophisticated art form, but it's contemporary. It's contemporary, but it's much, much harder to do. And therefore, it's high culture, but it's a contemporary high culture. And it enables us to do some interesting stuff. But actually, even there, we often use gospel in the evening service. We often do use Christian contemporary pop. We will do Twyla Paris songs, or we will do Amy Grant songs occasionally, and that sort of thing as well. We have found, though, in general, that non-Christians prefer the liturgical, not the moderately liturgical, not the contemporary. Why? Because in general, at least at this stage of our lives, maybe as time goes on it'll be different, and I think there will be a difference. By and large, non-Christians find the emotional engagement of the contemporary service a little bit unnerving to them. And what they like about the more moderately liturgical service is that they understand what's going on. It's pretty instructional. They see a shape to it. And also, liturgical services do not need a talking head talking all the time, saying, now we're going to go do this, now we're going to do this, now we're going to do this. That's just, and that's just, it's too busy, and it's not elegant. So we find, generally speaking, that our more moderately liturgical traditional music is the place where non-Christians feel the most comfortable. Over the years, I've had to say this over and over again because people say, what? You mean, their idea is you're going to reach secular non-Christians, you got to use contemporary music. I would say the quality of the music is far, the quality of the performance, the quality of the music is far more, I'll show you this in a second, far more important to reaching non-Christians than the content or the type. The quality is far more important. Anything you do, any kind of music you do, that is so well done, everybody just gets a sense of God. They go, wow. I don't even like that kind of music, but wow. That's really what actually is accessible and inclusive and draws people in, both Christians and non-Christians. Please do not hitch your wagon to the idea that if you're going to reach non-Christians, it's got to be contemporary music. Not necessarily. I don't know. Is that radical? Anyway, lastly, I don't know. You can tell me in a minute. The last thing to do is I've told you that we try to include Christians and non-Christians in every service. Now, 41. Why doesn't somebody tell me, I want you to get back past evangelistic worship to the place where it says, I know. It would be, if it's 39, probably page 49. You should have a heading that's saying, making worship comprehensible to unbelievers. Do you? Close. Okay. Some of you are going to get calluses from all this turning of pages. I'm sorry about that. All right. I'll go through this list. That's it. Our purpose in our services is to both edify and evangelize at the same time. These are not seeker services, but these are not worship services that don't include seekers. 1 Corinthians 14 is a place where Paul says to the Christians, look, now I know, I'm not even going to get into tongues and prophecy, but here's what you can see. He says, you're praying in tongues, prophesy, because when unbelievers come in, if they hear you prophesying, they'll be convicted that God is among you, right? Now, it's almost impossible, and for many years, I could never read that text without asking myself questions like, what do I think about prophecy? What do I think about tongues? But if you stand back, here's what Paul's saying. He says, if you worship like this, non-Christians who come into your presence won't understand what's going on. Worship like this, so when non-Christians come into your worship service, they'll be convicted that God is here. That's it. That's that. I mean, there's many other things that Paul's saying, but there's one that's so obvious that, and we're so busy worrying about what is the tongues and the prophecy all about. He is saying, expect people in your services who are not Christian and make sure that your worship is done in such a way that it's comprehensible. So our purpose is not to make the unbeliever comfortable. Our purpose is to be intelligible. And there's an awful lot of folks who are so freaked out by the idea of seeker services that they are completely against the idea of even being intelligible. 1 Corinthians 14:25 says, the secrets of their heart will be revealed. When they hear you prophesying, the secrets of their heart will be revealed, and they'll fall down and they'll say, God is really here. Now, that's the kind of worship we're after. Worship that edifies, because don't forget, the reason that Paul says prophesy is why? Because it edifies. He says this edifies. So if they see you edifying one another, you can edify each other in a way that non-Christians get converted all the time. That's what you're after. I mean, I don't know whether I'm going to help you find exactly how to do it, but see it as a goal. Get rid of the idea of either seeker services or worship services, because this is the battle. We have people who say we've got to reach out to seekers, we've got to bring them in, and we've got people certainly who are saying that worship is not for non-Christians, it's for the people of God. And I don't think it's an either or. How do you get to this kind of service? Follow me. I won't talk about this anymore, but worship and preach in the vernacular. We talked about this. It's hard to overstate how ghettoized our preaching is. It's normal to make all kinds of statements that appear persuasive to us but are based upon all sorts of premises. Look at the last part of this paragraph. Speak respectfully and sympathetically to people with difficulty with Christianity. As you write your sermon, imagine a particularly skeptical non-Christian in the chair listening to you. Think about the people that you know who are really hostile, somebody in your family, and imagine them being in your service. And make sure your sermon would be okay if they were there. Every week. Add the asides, add the qualifiers, add the extra explanations necessary. If you knew you had that cousin that you've always known all your life, but who is absolutely, she or he is absolutely hostile to Christianity, just imagine them there every week, please. Wait till you see what happens. Listen to everything said in the worship service with the ears of someone who has doubts or troubles with belief. That's A. B. Explain the service as you go along. There's great danger here, and that's one of the reasons why I like more liturgical worship, because there's nothing worse than somebody who spends so much time telling you how you should be worshiping that we never have any time worshiping. But you can say things like, when we confess our sins, we're not groveling in guilt, but we're dealing with our guilt. If you deny your sins, you'll never get free from them. That's enough. That's over. How long did that take? 10 seconds? Don't just go into confession of sin. Do that. Say that. But don't say much more. Explain the service, okay? By the way, one of the things that we do that I think is helpful, one of the things I found out, the black church has a sermon before everything else. I don't know if you've ever seen that. The African-American church, very often, there is a kind of warm-up sermon. It's often called, at least in New York, they call it a devotional. But the devotional is 20 minutes long. And the people are coming in during the devotional, and there's music in the background, and people are greeting each other. It's so different. It's so different from, its cultures are fascinating, and it's wonderful. On the other hand, I could never even begin to try it. And yet, I learn from them, because what the devotional does is it prepares people for worship. And it kind of grabs hold of them and says, let me help you think of worship in a certain way. And that's very helpful. Explain the service as you go on. C, directly sometimes talk to people who don't believe. Say, now some of you aren't sure you believe this. In fact, I don't think I do it anymore. And to my surprise, more of you have listened to my tapes than I thought would be. So some of you may have heard this. I go through cycles in which very often when I get to the end of a service, I know for years I used to say this almost all the time. I say, some of you believe. You believe all this. But here's how you can practice it in a way that you've never practiced before. Some of you don't believe all this. Then I would like you to think about this text in this way. I think it might help you. And some of you don't know what you believe. I mean, over the years I've always said, some of you believe, some of you know you don't believe, and some of you don't know what you believe at all. And very often I take the text, whatever the passage is, and at the very end take, a minute or two for each group. Now, it's not a bad idea. If you do that, of course, what's very often happened in some churches is you may find people looking around saying, you mean there's people here who don't believe? But do it, and you may find that group will actually sprout up in your midst. Directly address and welcome them. Always, by the way, under C, always make sure that you put the objections and the doubts of an outsider in the absolute very best, most winsome possible way. You really have begun to get a non-Christian to listen to you when the non-Christian says, wow, he put that better than I could have put it myself. See, when they can tell that you actually have some sympathy for their doubts and you really have thought about it because you can express it better than they can, then they're going to listen to your answer, by the way. Because if you actually if you posed their question better than they could have posed their question, they're going to respect your answer. D, quality aesthetics. Now, I'm going to be careful because I know I'm in New York. And in New York, this is scary. In New York, there's just, it is a frightening thing to see the people singing and playing, begging in the subways. They have a violin, and they open the violin, and, the violin case is a place for you to throw money in, and they're playing in the subways, and they're good. They're really good. And you say, oh my gosh. Especially if you're a violinist from Albuquerque and you're the very best violinist in Albuquerque. You come to New York and you get out of the subway and you see, here's this guy, he's begging, and he's better than me. Oh my word, I better start to practice. So there's an embarrassment of riches in New York. In New York, L.A., Nashville is an embarrassment of riches. But if you look around, they're there. There's musicians everywhere. And quality aesthetics, very important. The power of art draws people. Good art and its message enters the soul through the imagination, begins to appeal to the reason. This might be controversial, but I must say it. The quality of music in speech and worship will have a major impact on its evangelistic power. In many churches, the quality of the music is mediocre or poor, but it doesn't disturb the faithful. Here's why. Your faith makes the words of the hymn or the song meaningful despite its artistically poor expression. And further, you usually have a personal relationship with the music presenter. Okay, look at me. Thank you. You all looked up. That was wonderful. You all did it together. Sally, she's in 8th grade, and she's going to play a clarinet solo today for our offertory. She's terrible. Now, she's terrible. But you know what? Everybody in the church has no trouble worshiping. Why? We love Sally. We remember her coming up. You know, she babysat us, and we're just so happy that she's willing to do this. And actually, the clarinet solo ministers to us, as it were. I don't know what that word means exactly, but you know, you're able to, because you're having a horizontal experience with her. You're not having a vertical experience. There's no sense of transcendence. You're not saying, God is great. Not in the middle of a clarinet solo by little Sally, who's not very good. But what you are sensing is community, right? But what if you're a visitor? What if you're a visitor? You don't know Sally. All you know is this stinks. And so they're left right out. Now, in other words, the better the music, the more inclusive it is. Do you see that? Because if the solo is terrific, the non-Christian is drawn in and goes, wow. And the Christian goes, wow. But if the music isn't any good, because it's really just somebody in the congregation who really wants to use his or her gifts, and we all know her, but the non-Christian doesn't know her, well, the quality of aesthetics is more inclusive. You see? I know this is controversial. And actually, if you say, no, it's not controversial, I believe it, well, just try it. Pastorally, you'll see what happens. What happens is you got people in the congregation who are not very good in their music, and they want to use their musical gifts. And it's very difficult politically and relationally to say no. But they're really not very good, and they actually don't include non-Christians very well by their music. So I would suggest that the low level of artistic quality in many churches guarantees only insiders will continue to come. Maybe we should get back to that. A, B, C, D, E. Celebrate deeds of mercy and justice. When a non-Christian comes in, and here's us celebrating an evangelistic event in the neighborhood that brought people to Christ, that's interesting. But in a way, what you're saying is, we have done something that benefited our tribe. But when you celebrate rehabilitating homes for the poor, when you celebrate deeds of justice and mercy in the community, you're celebrating something that your church does that actually benefits everybody. In other words, what you want to do in your worship services is you want to celebrate those things that show your community you love them whether they believe or not. Now, if you don't have anything to celebrate, then you better go get something. Because that's the sort of thing that if you're celebrating, you're having testimonies of that. If you're lifting that up, if you're having offerings like that. Now, this sounds, somebody's going to get me, is we have an offering. We have a special, once a year, special mass offering. It's an addition to our regular offering for the diaconate. And the diaconate takes money, and we redistribute it within the church for people who are in need or who have lost their jobs and that sort of thing. We get an enormous amount of money for that. We used to have a special offering for missions. And we came to realize that we need to really press Christians to give, but actually it wasn't a very good act of worship when 25 to 30% of the people who were present weren't sure they believed. So what we realize is we can invite non-Christians into an act of offering if they know the money goes to do deeds of mercy and justice that benefit the entire community. They get quite excited about that. They understand it. It's a little difficult to ask non-Christians to give money to doing something that actually benefits our particular denomination or our tribe or our church, but not the whole community. So believe it or not, what this means is we have eliminated all special offerings that don't go to the poor and the needy. So, I don't know, you're getting quiet? That's right, it's late. Page next. What you really want to do is you want to have people to say, you want a non-Christian to come into a church and after coming to worship for several weeks say, this church is channeling so much value into our community through its services to people that if it went out of business, we'd have to raise everybody's taxes. That's hard to get, but anyway, you're aiming for that. Okay, F. Present the sacraments so as to make the gospel clear. You can read that later. In other words, don't do baptisms and Lord's Supper without... What do you do with the Lord's Supper? Here's how I do the Lord's Supper. I say the Lord's Supper is for people who know that they're Christians, have given their lives to Jesus Christ, that are baptized. You don't have to be a member of this church, but you need to be a baptized Christian. But if you're here and you're not a Christian, or you're not sure whether you're a Christian, here's what you can do. This is great. Don't take the bread and the wine. Take Christ. You can do business with Jesus. In fact, when better than now? You know, give yourself to Christ and then tell somebody, and the next time we do the Lord's Supper, you can take it up as a member of the family of God. So there's a way of both edifying and evangelizing with the Lord's Supper and still fence the table in a traditional Presbyterian way, which might be a little more severe than in your own traditions. Preach grace. I've already told you this is incredibly important, but I'm going to get to that after the break, the last one. If you preach, do I put it down here? Yeah. If you do not understand that the main thing a Christian needs to overcome worry is the gospel, and the main thing parents need to raise their children is to understand the gospel, and the main reason some people overwork is they don't understand the gospel. Now, if that hasn't completely sunk in, I'll get back to this after the break, after the last one. But when you understand that, or to the degree you understand that, you can preach the gospel every week. You're applying the gospel to the Christian to edify them, but the non-Christian is getting to understand the gospel in multiple perspectives. That is absolutely critical. If you don't believe that, you are utterly stuck. You can either do evangelistic sermons that directly simply say, here's how to become a Christian, and you'll bore the Christians, or you can have directly kind of instructional sermons on here are the biblical principles for this area, and here's the biblical principle for this area, and you leave the non-Christians behind. But unless you know how to preach the gospel is the basic problem that we all have. The gospel is not the ABCs of the Christian faith, it's the A to Z. It's not just the way to get into the kingdom, it's the way to grow in the kingdom and the way to spread the kingdom through your heart and through the world. If you believe that, then you can have services that both evangelize and edify. Otherwise, you can't. And then, that's basically it. Okay. Yeah. See, look at the second paragraph after G. You see where it says, if the response to this? If your response to the idea of evangelistic worship services every week is Christians will be bored, it shows, this is on page what? 49. Page 49, this is the fourth paragraph from the top. It shows a misunderstanding of the gospel. The gospel is free, gracious justification and adoption. It's not just the way we enter the kingdom, but the way we grow into likeness in Christ. Look at Titus 2, 11-13. It tells us how, in the original, saving message of grace alone, that consequently leads us to sanctified living. Because here's what Paul says. The grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age while we wait for the blessed hope, the appearing of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. Now think about this. I'll just read it. Many Christians are defeated and stagnant in their growth because they try to be holy for wrong motives. They say no to the temptation by telling themselves God will get me, or people will find out, or I'll hate myself in the morning, or it'll hurt my self-esteem, or it'll hurt other people, or it's against the law, I'll be caught, or it's against my principles, or I will look bad, or I'm a minister, I shouldn't be doing this. Some or all of these may be true, but Titus tells us they're inadequate. Only the grace of God, the logic of the gospel will work. Titus says it's the grace of God that teaches you to say no, and if it's not that teaching you to say no, you really won't be able to say no. So if you don't know how to show people to be godly and temperate and all this stuff, with the grace of God, your services are going to have to choose. You can either edify the saints or evangelize the non-Christians, but you can't do both. Okay. So there's some relatively controversial things, I think, to say about worship, I think. But now, I'll symbolize my accessibility by coming down a step. No, also symbolize my my advanced age and my lack of hearing. Questions about what I just went through, but anything else so far today? Yes, here.
Your point regarding transcendence and roots and community, do you feel that is possibly an age issue rather than these are different generation issues? Because when you talk about boomers versus
Yeah.
Gen X, there's inevitably an age split there too, that maybe as people grow older, they want hospital service. They don't want the hospital.
We'll see. What he's saying is it possible that when the people who right now want transcendence get to the age of the people who don't want transcendence, they won't want transcendence either. I know this is the case. I know that as a baby boomer, that the kind of Christianity that was sort of forged in my college years and right afterwards, some of the things that we thought we'd want all of our lives went away. We just didn't do it. I mean, we did dress up. We did learn to wear suits. I mean, there's certain things that the boomer generation kept, and there's certain things that they discarded as they got older. Some of the things we thought were our permanent possessions as a generation were actually just the possessions of young people that you get rid of as you get older. And some of them are permanent possessions. And if you're saying, is it possible that this might be not a permanent possession, but something that is particular to the fact that they're young, I don't think this one is. I don't think this one is. I may be wrong. George Gallup was in the city about a year ago and gave a very interesting lecture about the hunger for mystery and spirituality. He says non-white people and anybody at all under the age of 30 show significantly greater desire for transcendence, spirituality, and spiritual experience. Significantly. There was actually just another study came out from the University of Pennsylvania I saw online just about 2 months ago that said that teenagers right now, surveys show more interest in spirituality and religion and spiritual experience than 10 years before that. Much more. Much more. And 10 years ago was much more than 10 years before that. I don't think so. You may be right. I don't think so. But, it really is just intuitive. I mean, I can't prove it but I don't think so right now. But it's the right kind of question to ask. See, I can affirm you, even though I'm not sure I agree with you. But it's exactly the right kind of question to ask. And that's what worries me a little bit about the kinds of churches that they say we're starting postmodern churches, and what they really are doing is they're starting churches for people who are in their early 20s. And in New York, I've got secular people. You see, in Charlotte, North Carolina, almost all the secular people are under the age of 25. And so if you want to reach secular people, you can just concentrate on that little demographic group and make everything just the way they want it. I can't do that in New York because we've had secular people for a lot longer, and I'm glad I can't do it because I'm afraid it'll look dated. In about 10 years, some of that is going to fall away. Some of the things that people in their early 20s think is great right now, they're going to outgrow, and some they will not. And I'm not sure which it is, but I don't think the hunger for transcendence and spiritual experience is one of them. Keep going. I got to go to the left because I never call on the left. Go ahead.
We're talking about, when you gave the example of, the girl that everybody likes, playing that, not being very well.
Her name was Sally. Please remember that. Sally gets her feelings hurt. Yeah.
Get the performance and be touched by how people around them, they'll feel comfortable. They'll feel like, I can give to this group of people because they're accepting her.
I absolutely agree that what he's saying is, if people who are not Christians really are seeking community, they want to see signs of community, and what they want to see, though. In general, what they want to see, it'd be much more powerful for them to see you embracing people of different races, embracing people who are untidy or maybe poor, as much as possible. that's not the best way to show them community, is what I'm trying to say. There are much more impressive ways to show that this is a community of people who really love one another, and the gospel breaks down barriers. But I see what I mean. It's just not the best. You're right. I think a sensitive non-Christian could see that, but it's really not the best example of how we love each other in spite of everything. There's so many more poignant ways to do it. But yes, the answer is probably they could see that. Sure, it's not the end of the world if Sally's. I'm trying to give you a kind of general principle, and you can't completely avoid Sally's. You shouldn't try to completely avoid Sally's because then you have become too corporate. But I'd like you to kind of veer away from Sally's. That's all. Yes, go ahead. Sure.
What about I'm from a rural church.
Good.
Sometimes it's not as easy to have a well-polished worship team or worship experience. There are certain resources in the church that
Right.
do it. So what would you do?
That's a big question. If my worship arts guy was here, he'd have. My worship arts guy was a Southern Baptist raised in Virginia. He's got a PhD from Manhattan School of Music. He's a terrific jazz pianist. And he believes we have 400 full-time musicians at least in the church. And by full-time, he means people that make their money playing, not just people who do it on the side. And yet, he really will say he has a pretty good rap. He has a pretty good way of talking to people from rural. In other words, he's from rural Virginia, and I think one of the things he would say is that first of all, there actually are more musicians out there. If you're willing to reach out to a musician who's not part of your community, he said, if your church is inclusive of non-Christians, very often you have a non-Christian music person in your vicinity that really you could draw on and could really help out. The church has to be welcoming to that person. The church also has to overcome, perhaps, a feeling like a non-Christian shouldn't be playing. Now, some churches feel that way, and that's that. What we try to do is we don't want to have non-Christian soloists, but we really try to have because a non-Christian soloist is kind of like a person who's up there reading the scripture or exhorting. But when we have more than one. If you have a pianist and a flute, which, by the way, isn't a bad way to do certain kind of light folk songs. Does the flute player really have to be a Christian? As long as the church realizes it's ministering to the musicians, you can go out and get some really, really good ones. Very often, a lot of them become Christians. A lot of them do. Because we have seen quite a few that do. And that is really one way to go. But he's actually, Tom's, as you know, Tom is actually pretty open to communicating with people, right? He gets so many references like that, questions like this, that he's actually developed 1 or 2 sheet little things that he'll email back to you. So if you go tom@redeemer.com and ask him and say, I told you so. He said, Tim Keller told me I could do this to you. He really will respond. So he's got some pretty good ideas about it. Other questions? Yes, sir, over here. I don't think, they're still awfully young. I don't think we've gone far enough to know. I mean, my Asian American families are still in their early 30s, so I'm not sure I could tell you yet. Do you think they might?
I'm just curious.
You're curious, yeah.
I see a lot of Asian Americans in non-ethnic churches.
Right.
And when I interviewed them, I said, where do you see yourself in 10 years after you have children? Virtually all of them say they intend on going back to the ethnic church because they want their children to learn the language.
Yes, that's right. Well, I didn't mention this before. The only thing I could tell you is I know that if you have, you have parents, here's your parents, and you have 3 children. Parents are from the old country. 3 children are all, say, born and raised in New York. or born and raised in America, they do not have equal, and it's not even necessarily a birth order thing, but they're not the same. One of them wants to stay in the monoethnic situation. One of them wants to really say, I don't need that ever again, and one of them comes out and goes back. I'm not saying, by the way, it's 1, 2, 3 either. I'm not saying it's a third, a third, a third. I'm just saying there's a spectrum. And I have, if the Asian American churches that people who are trying to start English-speaking Asian American churches make any Asian Americans feel guilty about being in a multi-ethnic church, or if the Asians in a multi-ethnic church make the people in the Asian American church feel guilty, like, why are you in that ghetto? You see, there's ways of doing this. What are you doing in that ghetto? Well, what are you doing sort of betraying your identity? Stop it. Come on, do you really have a biblical case that you can say, it can't be this or it can't be that? Can you? I mean, you can always find a biblical text and say, well, what about Ephesians 2? You're supposed to be multi-ethnic. Well, it's also true. What about contextualization? The fact is, no church is really all things to all people. On the day of Pentecost, everybody heard that sermon in his or her own language, but since Pentecost, you can never be all things to all people at the same moment. You can't be all things to all people. It's the minute, I've mentioned this before, the minute I open my mouth, I've contextualized in a certain direction. And so you can't say, everybody should be in a multi-ethnic church. Well, nobody's in a multi-ethnic church because you're selective. We're mainly Anglo and Asian. And there's a lot of other... your ethnicity has always only got a range to it. Depends on your language. It depends on all sorts of things. So really, we should be very, very careful not to beat up on each other. So, and the same. This isn't just an Asian American thing. We're talking about it because of Redeemer. The same thing with African Americans. Same thing with Latinos. We need multi-ethnic churches because there's a whole lot of people that will only grow there and evangelize through those multi-ethnic churches. We must not be self-righteous if we're in a multi-ethnic church against the more mono-ethnic churches, or vice versa. Just stop beating up on each other, and let's see. That's very important, I think. So, yes? Oh, sorry, you're... Yes, but you need to get that hand up there. Sure.
The first one is, how do you respond to the demographic changes that are happening so fast in New York City? Like you say, you are targeting by geography area, the top demographic. So
Right.
it's changing rapidly. And how does the church respond to it by spinning off a daughter church?
Yes. That's the first question, is how do you respond to the changes? For example, there was virtually no Mexicans in New York City when I got there in 1989. I looked. And now it's enormous. In fact, the Mexican embassy of the United Nations is around the corner from the church. And there are lines around the block every single day of people for various reasons trying to get in the embassy. We've temporarily brought a missionary, a friend of mine who's been in Mexico for years and who was raised in the Philippines. He's bilingual, and he's working on some church planting in that area. Our bias is, by and large, to form mono-ethnic churches, especially churches that are after people who don't speak English, but also create churches that are multi-ethnic that are very closely tied, because we know that over a period of time, some of the kids of that church are going to want the multi-ethnic church, and some will not. And you just cannot say, this is the way it's got to be. Everybody's got to be into these. We want to have multiple options. Cable television. So the answer is, we've responded. There's places that was... Astoria was completely Greek, 80,000 Greek-speaking people. There hasn't been any Greek immigration in 10 years. It's turning Hispanic. So we plant a church. What was your second question?
I know that a lot of people who are single, the demographic, they're actually living together and having marital relations. So what is the church position like when they're raising people?
Well, finish the question, though.
What is the church
Position when?
When people come into the church and say it's okay for us to live together?
Yeah. Sister's pointing out that an awful lot of single people in the city live together. Or even if they're not living together, they're sleeping together, with their boyfriends, girlfriends. Yeah, it's a big problem. As a matter of fact, we guess that a large number of people who probably have become Christians take a long time to join the church, or maybe never join the church, because they don't feel like they can handle celibacy. And it's to some degree, we talk about sex a lot. First of all, this is one of the answers to your question. We talk about sex a lot, even in the worship service. But by and large, I try to keep it to. We have a monthly meeting. We have about 175, 180 small groups. Each one has 2 leaders. Every 5 has a coordinator, and over every 5 to 10 has a full-time staff person. So once a month, we get a lot of people together. That's all of those people. That's something like 200 or 300 people. And I talk about sex a great deal because the small group leaders are always saying, "What do I do with the fact that I've got people in the church?" I give them talking points on how to talk to people lovingly, gently, non-prudishly, but firmly about the fact that you shouldn't be doing this. And here's the reasons why. I know some of you are going to want them, but I don't know what to say. I gave you 75 pages of handouts. Aren't you sad? Huh? It's more than that?
Well, more on sex.
Yeah, well, I basically say, what you need to understand is that when you first start, I assume they're having sex. I say, don't you remember when you first had sex with somebody how jealous you were? I mean, imagine the first person you ever had sex with, the very, very next day, you knew they were having sex with somebody else. Wouldn't that have bothered you? And I say, here's the reason why. God intended physical oneness to go along with every other kind. God intended physical oneness to go along with legal oneness, emotional oneness, social oneness, every other kind. It is an absolute inconsistency. It's a monstrosity to be physically naked to somebody but not be emotionally, socially, and legally naked. Why aren't you married? Because you're trying to hold on to your life. You don't want. See, to get married means you become vulnerable to the person. You become legally vulnerable. So what you want to be is physically naked and not be socially and personally naked. That's hypocrisy. So you have to. That's entering the story, which is sincerity and openness and integrity, but it's challenging the story. You can't just say, "Don't you know that God's going to get you?" If you see, there's ways to talk about this that don't enter the story. I'm trying to give you my communication theory a little bit. And so we try to prep our small group leaders about how to talk about it. The second thing is we every so often, it's well known in the church. This is one of the things that's so radical about Redeemer. We say you shouldn't have sex outside of marriage. That's considered radical. In fact, I can continually have people say, "Well, I knew Catholics believe that, but you mean Protestants believe that?" It's just. But it's a great experience. It's a great way to talk about commitment, and to show them that they've made an idol out of their commitment. But I get you. The main thing is when people say, "I don't think I could handle celibacy," it's pretty clear that they have turned their sexual desires into some kind of idol. I said, a lot of people have lived without sex. If there's a lot of places where it can be done. You really have turned that into something way, way too big. So we talk about it quite a lot. But a lot of people still don't join because they don't feel like they can handle it. It's good. It's good to have a high bar, so that's what we've been trying to do. Great questions. Okay, I said I was going to get somebody in the back row. Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier that you felt as though you failed in the discipleship area.
Yeah.
Sounds like you're doing a great job at it for the last few minutes there. Did you say that because you have so many unbelievers or new believers in the church?
Yeah, it's just it's overwhelming. In some ways, we're doing very well. Our materials are very good, and we're actually trying to create a one-year experience now because we realize that it takes too long for people to get into a small group. It takes too long for people to get through the curriculums we've developed. So we're developing a one-year curriculum and developing 3 big kind of highly visible, high-profile conferences a year. One is called The Gospel in the Heart, in which we talk about how the gospel changes your life. Then there's The Gospel in the World, where we talk about the poor, we talk about the city, we talk about evangelism, and then The Gospel in Community, where we go through sex, money, and power. And these are big, high-profile conferences. They're in the city. They're at the Hilton. It tends to draw new people in because they're kind of excited. They want to meet people. And when we get them there, we get them into groups. So that instead of coming for weeks before they find a group or months before they find a group, we get them right into groups and we put them through a one-year, 30-week curriculum. And we've just started this year, but we're hoping to always have 400 or 500 people going through it at any given time. But the problem is there's always all these horror stories. The staff gets together, the small group leaders get together, and there's always all these horror stories of people who've been coming to Redeemer for a pretty good while, and their beliefs or their practices still are terrible. So no, I don't feel... I didn't present a discipleship case study. I'm not proud of what we're doing, I guess. Yes?
What did you consider a while? When you say, is that 6 months? Or what do you consider someone's been coming for a while?
Oh, well, I don't know. Even a couple of years. If somebody, people are coming for a couple of years, and they're still sleeping with their girlfriend or their boyfriend, and yet they're coming to the Bible study, and it doesn't seem to bother them. You say, there's a failure there of some kind. But we have lots of them. So. Okay, you know what? Where's David Horn? Don't we have to take a break? Take one more? Well, I need to go to the left because they're underrepresented. Yes, sir?
Just a quick question, getting back to earlier this morning, you were talking about the different way to frame sin for postmodern people, talking about the 3 verses.
Right.
Thing. I find when I'm sharing the gospel with postmodern, pluralistic, relativistic people,
Right.
Who don't have any conception that there is truth, or any sort of, objective anything, that when that I feel like I sort of need to demonstrate that there is truth in general before getting into Christ, but then I slide into moralism too much. And so
Yeah.
what's the corrective to that?
Well, I'm just going to show you something in the old. If you take a look at the earlier case study, which was the one on evangelism. I wonder if I still have it here. Yeah. There's a whole lot of examples in the middle, and if you read these, it'll be better than anything I say in the next 2 minutes. When you get to, I don't know what there's a place where it talks about presenting sin, some examples of entering and retelling, and it would be probably 27 or 28. Do you see that? That, first of all, I had gotten, listen, get Kierkegaard's book, A Sickness Unto Death. Unbelievably helpful. In fact, when you go to a guy like Kierkegaard, you wonder to what degree Kierkegaard was prescient and knew about the future, to what degree people have followed Kierkegaard because, he was kind of weird. He was an existentialist, and a lot of his stuff was great, but a lot of his stuff is kind of odd. In Sickness Unto Death, he basically said sin is a failure to really build your life on your identity on God. And he talks about that. Now, that's psychological. You're starting with the psychological, right? But in here, you sit down and you just try to contrast, well, what are you building your life on? You ask them. And you show them, if you're able to show them the fragility of it and the insecurity that comes from it, in fact, show them their own moralism. See, moralism is, if you live for people's approval, if you live for your career, then you're moralistic in the sense of you're trying to save yourself. You're trying to earn your own sense of self-worth. You don't believe that you're going to heaven, but essentially you're trying to earn your version of salvation through merit. And the whole idea is to show them that they're the ones who are the Pharisees. And if they don't live up to their career like a kind of little false god in their head all their life is going to make them feel like there's no way. Your career cannot die for your sins. So there's only one Savior that can die for your sins. If you make any other thing a Savior, it can't die for your sins. It can never forgive you. That's all in there. The other thing to do is on can I show you one thing? Is that page 27? Okay. Turn to page 28. Okay. You see presenting the authority of the Bible? Let me just give you a couple of examples of this entering and yet retelling as a way of doing communication. You see where it says presenting the authority of the Bible? How do you argue for objective truth? It's not easy with people who don't believe it, but you know what? There's a way to go. There's a couple ways to go. One is the traditional ways to argue for the infallibility of the Bible are the evidentialist way, fulfilled prophecies, archaeological findings, historicity arguments, and so on, or the presuppositional way. I got a completely postmodern way to do it. Here's an alternate approach. See? Most contemporary people are allergic to the idea of absolute truth or an infallible Bible. They hate the idea. Here's how you can enter their story. Don't you want a personal relationship with God, you say? I mean, if there is a God and you could know him, wouldn't it want to be personal, intimate? Wouldn't you want to sense his love? Wouldn't you really want to have an interaction? Well, of course. Well, if you want a personal relationship, the other person will have to be able to contradict you. If a wife can never contradict her husband, you don't have a personal relationship. Do you remember the movie The Stepford Wives? Do you know it's being remade right now in Connecticut? And they're actually getting real, trophy wife Connecticut women to play the Stepford Wives. Now, you remember what the Stepford Wives was? And that was it was a little community of people in Connecticut. You know how Connecticut is. And the men did not want women who ever got fat, ever got old, and ever talked back. So they had them killed and replaced with robots who always said, yes, dear, yes, dear, yes, dear, all the time. That's a wonderful story. It's heartwarming and... Of course, you don't have a personal relationship with someone who can't contradict you, right? Now, if you pick and choose what you want to believe in the Bible, right? If you say, well, I like these parts of the Bible, but I can't accept an infallible Bible because there's certain things that offend me and they upset me. There's certain things that are primitive and that sort of thing. Now, here's what I would say. How will you ever have a God who can contradict you? How will you ever have a God that will tell you something that contradicts your deepest feelings? Only if God can be or say things that outrage you will you know you have a real God and not a figment of your imagination that you've just concocted. So an authoritative Bible is not the enemy of a personal mystical relationship with God. As a matter of fact, it's the precondition. Jesus related to God on the basis of the Bible. You won't be able to finish your own story, which is you want a personal relationship with God, unless you're willing to believe in an authoritative Bible. I said, look, you don't have to believe in an authoritative Bible. I can't prove that to you. But you can just kiss goodbye the idea that you're going to have a real God there and not a Stepford God. Yes, dear, yes, dear, yes, dear. I wouldn't want to offend you. Now it's entering the story and making them at least open to it. That's not all I'm ever going to tell people about the Bible, but it brings them up short. Or here's my last example, David. You encouraged me to go on. Turn to the next page. Let me give you an example. Miroslav Volf, at Yale, wrote a book called Exclusion and Embrace. You see this thing called Teaching on on the Doctrine of Judgment. Nobody likes the idea of a God who has absolute standards and who's going to eventually, bring those standards to bear on the world, and he's going to judge evil, and nobody likes that idea, right? Well, think about this. You see the Miroslav Volf quote? It's in the middle of the page. Listen to this. This is terrific. My thesis, he's Croatian, remember? My thesis is that the practice of nonviolence requires a belief in divine vengeance. My thesis will be unpopular with many in the West. Yes, I guess so. But imagine speaking to people, as I have, whose cities and villages have been plundered, then burned and leveled to the ground, whose daughters and sisters have been raped, whose fathers and brothers have had their throats slit. Now, your point to them, we should not retaliate. Why not? I say the only means of prohibiting violence by us is to insist that violence is only legitimate when it comes from God. Violence thrives today, secretly nourished by the belief that God refuses to ever take the sword. It takes the quiet of a suburb for the birth of the thesis that human nonviolence is a result of a God who refuses to judge. In a scorched land, soaked in the blood of the innocent, the idea will invariably die, like other pleasant captivities of the liberal mind. If God were not angry at injustice and deception and did not make a final end of violence, that God would not be worthy of our worship. Now, you know what he's saying? Here's what he's saying. He says, if I, as a Croatian, have experienced this kind of oppression, if I don't know that someday God is going to make everything right and everything is going to be square and no one's going to get away with anything, if I don't believe in that, I'm going to pick up the sword and I'm going to go get those suckers. And I'm going to be sucked into the eternal cycle of vengeance. And if you think, therefore, that the idea of a God of vengeance, the God of judgment, leads to warfare, you don't know what you're talking about. You have lived a very, very comfortable life, probably in a suburb in California. It says, you don't know what you're talking about. So you see, now look, here's the entry point and the challenging point. The entry point is peacemaking, suffering of the oppressed. Boy, that's something postmodern people are very concerned about. One of our very biggest problems today is how to get people who deeply differ to live together in peace. How do you stop the endless cycle of vengeance and violence? How do you stop people from paying back? Most secular people believe that religion only makes the cycle of violence worse. It would be better for peace if more people were religiously skeptical like most Western intellectuals are. That's what they think. But here's the challenging point. That's naive. held by people who themselves have not suffered violence. If I'm violated, only a deep belief in the God of justice will enable me to refrain from picking up the sword and rendering my own justice. The only way to nonviolence is belief in a God of judgment and vengeance. Now, I remember a friend of mine in the church brought a non-Christian friend. He was right there when I used that in a sermon. They went out to eat afterwards. And intriguing, the guy said, they talked about it, and the non-Christian said, I utterly, utterly hate the very idea of a God of vengeance. And I hated the whole point. I hated that whole part of the sermon. But I have no answer. He's probably right. If you don't believe in a God of justice and judgment, there's no reason why not to pick up the sword. There's really no reason why not. Why not go get the suckers? He says, I never thought of it like that, and I don't like anything like that, and I don't want to come back to church. That's what he told him, and never did, never came back. I consider that a win. Because you know what? When something goes wrong in his life, he will be back to church. He just doesn't need, you have to have the intellectual credibility with the existential need. They have to come together. Otherwise, you don't have a conversion.